Hello, everyone. This is Margaret Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of the Trumpeter Swan Society, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Lead Poisoning in Trumpeter Swans. It's great to have you all here. I really appreciate that, and I just want to let you know lead poisoning is a significant problem for trumpeter swans, so hopefully you'll get a better understanding of what is entailed with lead poisoning in swans and treatment. Today's webinar is being recorded. You as a participant are muted and your video is turned off. We don't answer questions during the webinar, but you will be able to put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom. You can put them in at any time. And at the end of the webinar, there's going to be a very short survey when you close your browser. And you'll receive a link to the recording in 2 days. Just a little bit about the Trumpeter Swan Society. We've been around for more than 50 years, and we are involved with restoration and management, with research, education, and outreach. And one of our ways of outreach and education are these webinar series. So we're really glad to have you here. Our presenters today are Dr. Laurie Degernes, Dr. Renee Schott, and Carrol Henderson. And Laurie is a retired avian professor, and she's very knowledgeable about lead poisoning. And she's been on our board and has been involved with lead poisoned birds for years. Dr. Renee Schott is the medical director at the Minnesota Wildlife Rehab Center, and Carrol Henderson is retired Minnesota Department of Natural Resources non-game wildlife supervisor. And with that, I'm going to get started off with Laurie.
Okay, good morning. Thank you. I've already done the introduction, so next slide, please. I'll be covering background information and a little bit of the historical perspective of lead poisoning and trumpeter swans and waterfowl in general. And Dr. Schott will talk about the veterinary medical aspects of managing lead poisoned swans. And at the end, Carrol Henderson will talk about lead prevention options, particularly in Minnesota. And in the middle, Margaret will also talk a little bit about some field sightings to help people recognize lead poisoning in trumpeter swans. Next slide. So just a little bit of background. What is lead poisoning? It's caused by ingestion of heavy metals in the form of lead shot or lead sinkers, and it can cause widespread ill effects in birds. It'll affect the nervous system, the gastrointestinal system, the kidneys, the bone marrow, and so on. And Dr. Schott will talk more specifically about the clinical signs, as well as Margaret talking about some of the field observations of what a lead poisoned swan might look like.
Laurie, you accidentally muted yourself. Can you unmute yourself?
And I don't know how that happened. Okay, sorry. So how do birds get lead poison? They ingest lead shot or lead sinkers directly or inadvertently by foraging for aquatic vegetation in wetlands or in field feeding. And they need sand and grit and gravel for digestion of food in their muscular part of their stomach called the gizzard. So it could be that they're selectively picking up shot, either still shot or lead shot, as part of this foraging for gizzard or for grit for the gizzard. But anyway, it involves ingestion of lead. They don't get lead poison from lead that is shot into them. So if they have lead shot in their muscles, that's not a source of lead poisoning. Next slide. So common sources, as I mentioned, would be lead shot from waterfowl hunting or upland game bird hunting in agricultural fields, but primarily from waterfowl hunting over wetlands. And I show an example of steel shot versus lead shot in the bottom. Similar size, different color, but basically you can see how a bird would in the process of foraging for grit might inadvertently pick up shot of non-toxic or toxic shot. And another source, of course, is lead fishing tackle. So split shot lead or lead sinkers are common sources, and it really doesn't take very much to cause lead poisoning. One lead shot or one lead sinker could kill a swan. Next. So historically, we know lead poisoning has been a problem in waterfowl for more than 150 years. About 65 years ago, Belrose estimated that approximately 2 to 3% of the fall population of waterfowl died each year from lead poisoning, so a pretty substantial amount. And over the past 50 plus years, there's been dozens and dozens of papers that have documented worldwide lead poisoning in ducks, geese, and swans. So we know quite a bit about this problem, yet the problem persists. Next slide. And I first got involved with managing lead poison trumpeter swans in the late 1980s when I was working with the Minnesota and Wisconsin trumpeter swan reintroduction programs. And at that time, we documented lead poisoning in over 70 trumpeter swans that were presented to the Raptor Center where I was working as a veterinarian at that time. And less than half were successfully treated and released. Next slide. Shortly thereafter, lead shot was banned for waterfowl hunting in the United States in 1991. And in the first decade after the ban, there was a noticeable decline in the prevalence of waterfowl mortality due to lead poisoning, 44 to 67% decline. So things were looking up. It looked like it was a promising change for waterfowl. Next slide. However, the lead poisoning mortality didn't disappear in waterfowl or raptors for that matter. The next slide. And so also worked on a project in northwestern Washington state. And starting in the late 1990s, noticed that there's a higher winter mortality of swans. About 100 swans were documented as dying. And then over the next 2 winters, they collected about 400 swans. And so I took groups of vet students out there over 2 years, and we documented lead poisoning in about 80% of those birds, primarily trumpeter swans, but a small percentage were tundra swans as well. So we know mortality has persisted from lead poisoning across the United States and Canada as well. Next slide. And we sort of wondered, lead shot was banned over 30 years ago in the United States for waterfowl hunting and 25 years ago in Canada, sort of nationwide. So why do we still have problems? And we know that historically, probably hundreds of thousands of tons of lead shot were deposited in wetlands during waterfowl hunting over the years. And, estimates of a size almost 70,000 shot pellets per acre postseason. So the lead doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't disappear. It doesn't get ground, it doesn't dissolve. It sits there. It might get covered up by sediment. It might get covered up by organic material, but it's still there. And when there's drought conditions that allow easier access for foraging in areas that might be more heavily contaminated by lead, we'll see an uptick in lead poisoning, especially in the long-necked swans. At this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Margaret. She's going to be talking about some of the field presentations that we'll see, and then Dr. Schott will take over from there.
Great. Thanks so much, Laurie. I'll be really quick about this. These are swans that, I've actually seen, and I want to actually show you what it looks like in the wild. So if you're saying, hey, am I seeing a sick swan? What does it look like? Hopefully this will give you some indication of that. So lead does cause suffering and death, and it weakens and paralyzes the muscles, and eventually the swans are unable to fly. So if you have a swan that's there and doesn't seem to be able to fly, possibly it has lead poisoning. The other thing is it reduces the swan's ability to regulate its body temperature, causing it to freeze to the ice in the winter. And you can see, here's, the swan has severe lead poisoning and couldn't even lift its wings, and it was kind of scooting along the ice that way. Another sign of a sick swan is that it's isolated. They isolate themselves from other swans. And you can also recognize them because they will have drooping wings. This is part of that paralysis of the muscles. Now here are healthy swans. You can see where the tail, the feathers are perky, you know, and they're up, but here they're droopy. And that's one indication of that. The other thing that you might see is green bile that's vomited, and they also have like green diarrhea that comes out. And so this is what it looks like. You also see there's some discoloration of the mouth. So that's lead poison swan. And here are healthy swans, so you can see they don't have that. The other thing that happens is lead causes paralysis of the smooth muscles, so they can't eat and they can't swallow, and so they become really emaciated and they have muscle weakness. And actually, sometimes it's like picking up a paper mache swan. They might be, you know, normally they might weigh 25 pounds, and by the time you are able to get them with lead poisoning, they might be down to, you know, 10 or 12 pounds. Again, if you see a swan that has impaired flight or can't seem to move, that's another sign. And here's a swan. This is a cygnet that was actually frozen to the ice, so that happens too. Another sign is repeated head shaking. We'll see that in a couple videos, but that's when I see a swan that's shaking its head repeatedly, you know, my first thought is that a sick swan? And then also, they seem to be gasping for air. Here's a cygnet, and it's having difficulty holding its head up, and you can see it looks like it's gasping for air. And Renee will talk about this, but this is one of the radiograms of, I think this is lead fishing tackle in a swan carcass. Generally, by the time swans are weak enough to be able to capture them, by that time, you know, they have really grave issues with lead poisoning. And so most of the time, and you know, they're going to have to be euthanized. And, you know, our concern is also that, you know, lead can move up the food chain. And so here's a cygnet here that these eagles are eating. And, you know, maybe that in the grit, they'll get the tackle or the pellet that was there. I'm just going to show you a couple of slides. This is going to be the same cygnet. The cygnet is all by itself, and you'll see a couple of the symptoms. So you can hear the healthy swans, but this cygnet was all by, you can see a little bit of the gasping right here, and a little bit of the head shaking. What's going on? Here's the same cygnet. This is 4 days later. It's hard to see, but this is the swan right here, the cygnet, and you'll see it'll have a difficult time holding up its head. And you can see how those feathers, you know, they're just drooping. So here it's trying to hold up its head. It's gasping a little bit for air. A little bit of head shaking that's going on. And it's very lethargic, and it just can't keep its head up. So that's what a lead poison swan looks like. And I'm going to stop sharing now. And Renee, if you want to start sharing, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you all for having me. I see some familiar faces in the participant list. I'm really excited to be here. I'm going to try to go really quick because I have a lot to cover and not a lot of time. But in case you're not from Minnesota and aren't familiar with the Wildlife Rehab Center of Minnesota, we're the busiest wildlife hospital in the world. We've seen over 21,000 patients this year, so we're very high volume. Being on the Mississippi Flyway, we see about 200 species, including trumpeter and tundra swans. We do have a full veterinary hospital with a full veterinary staff, so it makes us unique compared to some other wildlife rehabilitation centers that our patients get veterinary care the minute they walk through the door. Pretty robust staff, and we do heavily rely on volunteers. I want to start out with you know, most of you are probably familiar with how horrible lead is, but sometimes a story can speak volumes. So I want to tell you the story of 88F. 88F is right here. He was first banned in 03A, and our case number is 1182. So we saw him back in 2011. Here he is with his mate and their cute little cygnets going along his merry way. Was doing great. He was in Wisconsin. And then one day he was noticed to have a bloody wing out on the lake. He had been shot. He was captured by volunteers and then brought into us for rehab care. He was lead negative, which was great, and had a through and through wound. It didn't hit any bones or any major structures. So he did really great, came into rehab with us, did well, and eventually was released. It was an amazing story. Like Margaret said, the proportion of swans that gets released can be low in some cases, such as lead. So anytime we get to release a swan, it's really, really exciting. So it was exciting. He was rebanded 88F, and a few days later, he was seen away from the release site here on the St. Croix, I believe. And this is his mate. He had been reunited with his mate. Last picture, her neck collar was half off, so it had fallen off by this point. But we were just really excited to have some post-release monitoring and see that he was doing well. Unfortunately, a couple months later, he was brought back into us. And this time he had high lead poisoning at 63 micrograms per deciliter. And he had no lead on his first admission to us. So we were pretty devastated. These are really old pictures, so forgive that we aren't wearing gloves in these pictures. We take PPE seriously now. And so every picture that there are no gloves, we do wear gloves nowadays for our safety and for our patients' safety. We don't want to give them anything. We admitted him and decided to treat him. And he stayed with us for about a week, but unfortunately he succumbed and he had to be euthanized about a week into his stay because he was found severely lethargic, unable to stand, unable to hold his head up, and gasping like you saw in Margaret's videos. So a really, really sad outcome for this guy who had survived, human detriment once already, and then unfortunately succumbed to lead poisoning. On necropsy, he did have some necrosis in his heart muscle. So another clinical sign we can see is little infarcts, little clots thrown, and he had thrown some clots into his heart, which is why he became so acutely down. So that was depressing. Let's revert more to patients and what we can do with them. So if you see a waterfowl, I know these are geese, but just some pictures I borrowed from WRR. WRR, Wildlife Rescue Release, is a local volunteer organization that goes out and captures animals for the public when they have volunteers able to do so. So we heavily, they bring us a lot of patients, which is really great. So when you see a gravely injured or injured bird, we can capture them on land. So here you can see this goose right here with the wing down. He's with his friends, but he can't fly. So he'll have to be caught not in flight, which is great, a little easier. And so with a net can be easy if the bird's down and out. The problem is, though, these are wild animals. And like Margaret said, by the time they are so down and out that they're unable to escape a human, they generally are pretty gravely ill. That doesn't mean you shouldn't bring them in, still bring them in, because we can save some of them. And I think it's better for them to be humanely euthanized than to just suffer in the wild, but that is up to the person rescuing. Ways to rescue safely on land. Again, we have the net. What you're going to have to do is have a bunch of people to sort of surround it so that it can't escape to the water. You can see here it's summer in here, and what our waterfowl do is they escape to the water. And then they're harder to catch, right? So if we can keep them on land, a little bit easier to catch, surround them with people. You can use nets, you can use sheets, you can use blankets, and try to throw it over the bird. Now, these slides talking about capture are not going to be a primer on how to do it. It's a little bit more complicated. So don't take this as, oh, I can go now capture everything, but sort of some hints and tips that will help you if you do see something sick in the wild. So on land, capture with a net, surround by people, use blankets or sheets, throw it over the patient, scoop the wings into the body, and then pick it up. Another method that I've heard of some people doing in the winter, especially when some of those injured waterfowl are relying on bird feeders and the seed that is dumped down, you could feed the bird and get it used to people slowly over time, or even move that bait pile like into a garage or something. But again, that'll take weeks to get them comfortable with it and get them really sort of trained in order to get into that enclosed space where then you can capture it and then bring it to a wildlife rehabilitator. Once they get onto water, it's a little bit more tricky. So here in this picture, WRR is capturing this swan right here. The swan can't fly, so it went to water to escape people. So the people now have to go onto water to try to get it. So we have people on kayaks, we have people in boats. I do want to make sure that you guys, if you try this, you're doing all the appropriate PPE that you need to. Here you can see everybody is wearing life preservers, and we need to make sure that we do that. If it's cold, you should probably have on wetsuits and have some backup safety plans just in case. So I have a video next. This again is a really old video, and I'm going to skip around just for time's sake if I can. How do I? Well, maybe I can't. It's a 2-minute video. I don't want to go through the whole thing though.
Well, that's fine, Renee. You can talk it through. So here they are. They obviously are kayaking out to the bird. Is that what they're doing?
Yeah, exactly. So we have kayak. Usually this old crew that used to rescue, they were a bunch of kayakers in a canoe. And so a lot of kayakers that are going to do the herding. And here we're going to find the bird. It's right here, way on the other side of this lake, swimming by the shore. So those kayakers and canoe are going to have to try to herd the bird and get it in between all of the boats so that they cut off all the escape routes for the birds. You can see them here. They're heading over. They should all be wearing life preservers. I see one rebel out there, and shame on him. But they're all heading over. And they're going to head over for a while. I wish I could fast forward this a little bit.
Yeah, that's fine. So Renee, is the bird sort of stressed out then at that time where it's trying to escape, or is it, if it has lead poisoning, is it so weak that it just kind of doesn't react too much to that?
Yeah, it's going to be both. Like the bird is definitely stressed, whether it can show us it's stressed or not. You mean like run on shore or fly away. It's not going to be able to if it's sick or injured. Here, it's going to try to take off and it can't. So if you're able to catch a bird in a kayak or a canoe or in a motorboat or on land with your hands, that bird is definitely sick or injured and should come in for an evaluation. And here you can see that bird is trying to fly. It is trying, but it can't. I will, spoiler alert, this particular individual, I don't remember if had lead poisoning, but it actually had a giant mass on its elbow caused by aspergillosis, which is a fungal infection that swans can get. You can see that left wing there is just unable to raise because the mass was like softball size. It was pretty gross. I did not include a picture because it's gross. So here they're trying to herd it. In the last picture you saw, WRR now has a motorboat that they use, and I think that makes it a little bit more efficient, that they can kind of keep on top of the swan a little bit more. But once they get it, you see now here, I think that might actually be Barry. He's grabbing the swan, so now he's got a hand on the swan in the kayak, but he can't pull the swan into the kayak because there's not enough room and the swans are still strong even when they're weak. So the canoe guy is going to come over and he's going to lift the swan up into the canoe. He's got either a net and or a blanket. I recommend like a blanket so you can fully cover the swan up, especially its head. Once their head is covered, generally they get a little bit calmer and they stop fighting as much, but you still may need to restrain the wings into the body. Is there anything else that I didn't cover, Margaret?
No, and I think it's more of, I know that sometimes on land, the bird will actually go limp. You know, once it's captured, they just go really docile. Sometimes people are afraid that a bird will bite, you know, or get scratched.
Yeah.
So that's not going to happen.
No, I don't really care about their beak. I mean, they can leave a little bit of a bruise if they get you and twist, but that's not a big deal. Their claws on their feet can be strong if you're like holding them like this. But really the biggest danger to people are their wings and their wrists. They can wing slap you really, really hard. And so getting their wings into their body is the most important part. So I like covering the head and then getting those wings into the body. However, up here in Minnesota, we got ice, and that makes things extra dangerous. So it's really important, and you'll see on WRR's post that they always talk about how they augured the ice before they go out on it to see how deep it is, and then watch the thinness of the ice as they get towards the center of the lake, because we cannot be putting people in danger for an animal. It doesn't matter. And occasionally, your local fire department may need some practice using some of their equipment that they don't get to use that often to rescue people. So here's Western Lakes Fire District. I believe this is in Michigan, and they were called out to a sick swan, and they got to use their hovercraft. Oh, it's a video too. They got to use their hovercraft to try to keep the swan from running away. So it's a little bit weird. You'll just see this hovercraft kind of circling the swan. And this firefighter who doesn't know how to capture swans is going to go up and get them and then miss and then get them again. But it doesn't hurt to call your local fire department and see if they'd be willing to help with one of these rescues. You can see that firefighter has his full gear on in case he falls through the ice. Again, really, really important that we regard human safety first before we do the animals. Okay. So I want to throw in a little bit of data about trumpeter swans admitted to us. We have really good electronic records from 2011. Before that, we just really have ins and outs. I did do the data back until I think 2005, a long time ago, but it's so old that I tend to exclude it now. So looking from 2011 up until yesterday, we've admitted 584 trumpeter swans. That's for everything. It's not just lead toxicity. That's every injury or illness. In the same period, only 18 tundra swans, which is why I'm focusing on trumpeters. Well, also, we're in a Trumpeter Society talk, so why not? My data is splitting the seasons, which isn't really fair when we're talking about weather trends. So Carrol's going to have some data from us that actually puts it into seasonality. So when you see our numbers, they're not going to be the same, and that's okay. I didn't have time to split into seasons, and he had that data, so it's great. So he'll show you the data in pure season form. So, right, winter of 2023 to 2024 will be one group. Mine is just 2024, so it spans last winter up until now. From my data and looking at it in year form, a little over a third of our swans come in with lead toxicity across the board. And here's the chart here. So the blue is the number of total swans admitted, and the orange is the number admitted lead positive. And when I say lead positive, I mean a blood lead level over 10 micrograms per deciliter, which is where we tend to see a lot of clinical signs. So at our center, we treat everything with a blood lead level of 10 micrograms per deciliter. We treat them and chelate them. If they're under that, we tend to see very few clinical signs, if any, and they tend to have their lead levels go down really fast without treatment. So that's why we choose that designation. So you can see it averages out a third, but there are years where it may be a little bit higher than a third. There's years where this year, I don't know why we had so few lead swans come in. I'm not complaining. I'm really happy that we had so few come in. But I do want to make the point that that doesn't mean that they're not out there dying. Carol's going to talk about, I think last year, the year before, where there were a bunch of Degernes lake swans that died of lead toxicity. Those guys died so fast they couldn't be brought into rehab. I think we might have got one or two, but they were almost dead. So just because we don't see them doesn't mean they aren't dying in the wild. It just means a person isn't finding them in time. Laurie talked about a bunch of the Laurie and Margaret talked about clinical signs and diagnosis of lead toxicity. So I'll go over this really quick, but it does affect almost every system in the body. And so we've already talked about lethargy, inappetence, GI slowdown and shutdown, muscle weakness, respiratory distress, heart and brain issues. I know eagles, they've done MRIs with lead toxicity and they have brain lesions, like parts of their brain that are gone and look crappy and aren't working. And so it's not just getting the lead out and we're all fine. It's about the permanent damage that has already been done in the body. And is it small enough that the body can fix itself? We can't regrow brain cells once lead has trashed them. So we have a lot of things to think about when we're treating lead toxicity and deciding to treat lead toxicity. How do we test for lead? Hopefully this is review for most of you, but if not, there is an in-house analyzer. Thank the Lord. It does require 0.1 mils of whole blood. Not a problem for a swan, but it is a problem if I'm trying to test a sparrow or something. The kicker is that it's only reading 3.3 to 65 micrograms per deciliter in the blood, but we have animals that come in with 2,000 micrograms per deciliter. So those are just going to read high on the machine, and we don't know if it's 65 or 2,000. So there still are challenges in diagnosing it. We do get the results really fast. It's $10 to $25 a sample after the machine is purchased, and I think it's $4 to $5 grand. And that's the lead cure too. If you don't have the machine you're sending out to the lab, it takes 2 to 5 days to get those results back. It's much more expensive, $30 to $60 a sample, but it is much more accurate. They're going to give you a number instead of, high. I also wanted to briefly touch in and not spend too much time on this, but I alluded to that lead is hard to treat. It is, excuse me. This chart is the percentage of trumpeter swans that we released that had lead toxicity. So 2011, we were able to release 28% of the lead positive swans that came in. In 2012, it was worse, 12%. And then 2014, it's up to 30%. And then 2023, we did great at 42%, right? This chart looks awful, right? You're like, why are some years so great? And why are some years so bad? This is why. Factors that affect that lead toxicity prognosis, the dose ingested. You can see here in this radiograph, all these bright white sparkles our lead, probably lead shot in the gizzard of the swan. That is a crap ton of lead. That is so much lead. And so every time the acid gets secreted into that gizzard, more lead comes off that shot, and that bird gets just a huge dose into his blood. And that is going to be much more detrimental than if it was one tiny piece of lead. A little bit less will get eaten off that lead every time acid's secreted. One other kicker we didn't talk about in the last slide when we're talking about blood level is that number on the machine does not directly correlate to the total body lead burden. So lead doesn't stay in the blood. It gets absorbed from the GI tract, it's put into the blood, and then the body stores it. Lead is kind of similar to calcium, so the body likes to throw it into bones, which sucks because it can be really hard to pull it out of bones. So if we have an animal that had eaten a smaller dose of lead, so it didn't die, it was able to survive, it's no longer in the GI tract, but it got stored in the bones. And so now those bones are slowly leaching that lead out into the body. And my drugs, they grab it from the blood. They don't do a great job grabbing it from the bones. So it can often take a long time to chelate it. Lots of details that probably aren't pertinent, but really make this a complicated condition to treat. Another thing that affects the lead toxicity prognosis is the length of time the lead was in the body. So has that animal had lead in their body for a long time? Days, weeks, months, years, or did they eat it a few days ago? So the dose combined with the length of time is sort of directly related to the amount of damage that has already been done in the body. And remember, if it's permanent damage, we can't fix that. All we can do is take the lead away and then hope the body can fix itself. The kicker with both of these is that we usually don't know the dose that's ingested or the length of time it's been in the body. The number of times we get a patient with lead in their GI tract is very small right now compared to the number of animals that come in with lead toxicity. We also need to remember that just because, like in this radiograph, we have lead in the gizzard and you're going, great, that's acute lead toxicity. It doesn't mean it's acute lead toxicity, because this patient could have had one piece in its gizzard for a couple of weeks and then eaten more and then eaten more, or they have all flushed out of the system, but he still had lead in his bones and then he ate more. So we're really guessing when we're talking about how much lead is in the body. Another kicker with these waterfowl, especially swans, is that to escape humans and to escape capture, like we saw in the capture videos, they simply just go on water. So most of our admits for these patients are going to be in the winter because they're on ice or they're getting so debilitated because of the winter, they can't find food and they can't survive. So they get sick, and we're able to capture them. During the summer, we get very few because they just go swim out on the water. They can be weak and swim on the water and be really hard for people to capture. And then the other thing is a lot of these guys do come in with comorbidities. They come in with other issues. So they come in with aspergillosis, with broken bones, with feather issues, with waterproofing issues, with different infectious diseases, avian influenza, right? So we have a lot of other comorbidities. Just because they have lead doesn't mean that that's all they have. Most of our wildlife patients have more than one issue. And again, a reminder that swans are really hard to catch. So to be caught, they usually are really ill and injured. Again, forgive the no gloves. It's a really old picture. So how do we judge the prognosis of lead swans? We looked back in our data early on when I started, so the early data, and found that the swans with severe clinical signs, I had 1 out of like 50 or 60 that made it to release. They're unable to stand, not holding their head up, and not feisty. When we check the blood lead on these guys, generally they're high, they're over 65 micrograms per deciliter, and their prognosis is really grave. We tried with a lot of these guys, and it's really sad. They'll bounce back the first couple of days with supportive care, right? They have food, they have water, they have hydration, they have pain meds, they're getting supplements that the lead has drained from their body. So they start to perk up, and then within a week they crash because of those permanent tissue damage that's happened inside. Our treatment protocol, I know some of you, I see some questions, are already interesting. Chelation, 2 medications we use to get the lead out of the blood and hopefully help it come out of the bones. Our calcium EDTA and DMSA, we've been unable to get calcium EDTA for a few years, but we think we have a new source. So hopefully we'll be adding that back in. We like the combination because they work just a little bit differently and kind of hit them with a big ol' 1-2 and get that lead out really fast. Fluid therapy, because those drugs are hard on the kidneys and because our patients come in dehydrated. And then pain medications. I would imagine a toxin that's affecting almost every system of your body would be painful. So we give them pain medications, anti-inflammatory medications, and then being a wild animal in rehabilitation is stressful. So we give them a lot of anti-anxiety meds as well. Adjunct treatment, zinc, vitamin C. So zinc, because the lead, the chelation drugs bind all heavy metals, not just lead. So they're draining the zinc from the body. We know how important zinc is, like it's in your emergency, in your airborne, those things important for immune system. Vitamin C, really good for immune system. Antioxidant is a really good adjunct for getting lead out of the body. We talked about how lead will cause GI slowdown. So GI support, either getting the GI moving faster with a prokinetic or an acid reducer, especially if you have lead in your GI tract, is really important. Iron is another one of those heavy metals that are drained by chelation. Our swans are really prone to aspergillosis, so we put them on an antifungal regimen when they come into rehab to hopefully knock down any spores that are hiding out, and the nutritional support as needed. If there is lead present in the GI tract, we're going to have to do a gastric lavage once they're stable. Again, forgive the gloves. But here we have a swan. It's attached to this tilt table, intubated, and we have a hose that goes into the stomach, and we're pumping water in, and it's coming back out alongside that hose, and it's emptying into this tub to hopefully flush the lead out. This is a very hard procedure. It takes a long time, and it's very hard on the swan's body. So we need to make sure the swan is stable before going through this treatment, but it is important to get that lead out because it's constantly leaching into the blood. Other problem or other factors that affect swans in rehabilitation is that they are large, right? North America's largest bird, so they need a lot of space. This is swans a long time ago in one of our rooms. They need an entire room because we can't, what they will do is they'll end up banging their wrists on the walls, on the floors if they don't have enough space, and there's no soft tissue of those wrists, and so they will get injuries. So in order to keep them healthy, they have to have a lot of room. They have to have something to swim in. I wish this was deeper. In our new building, we will have a much deeper pool for them so they can get off their feet, but they need enough water access. Swans aren't evolved to walk on land the whole time. So if you force them to, they will get foot lesions that will develop into osteomyelitis. You can see here we have the stress mats on the floor as well to help with that. They do need specialized care by skilled staff because of all the problems that can happen in rehab, and because of their different anatomy and physiology, we have to be very specially trained to care for them. It's very expensive. We estimate that chelation, when we're actively giving all those drugs, is about $200 per day to treat them. And the average stay of a lead swan is about 50 days. Roughly half those days are chelation. You can do the math, right? About $5K to treat a lead swan to release. So a very expensive way to manage this preventable problem. I think we in Minnesota take swans a little bit for granted because we have such great populations here. But if you go to other states, and those of you in other states can speak up that y'all don't have the trumpeter swan populations that we do, and you're still working to reestablish them in your communities. And so while we feel like we have enough trumpeter swans, for the whole of the North America, we don't. And so this is still a species that we are very worried about conservation efforts for. Okay, that is the end. So I'll stop sharing so that Carrol can pick up.
Okay, and I'll get, let's see, I'll do this one. And I'll bring this up again to Carol's.
Margaret, do you want me to answer some of the question and answers in typing, or do you want them all answered live?
We'll do that at the end.
Okay,
that
great.
way we can hear the answers. So, okay. So Carrol, are you there? You want to let us know what Minnesota has done and is doing about lead poisoning? Let's see. Carrol, are you there?
Yeah, he is. Let me just see. I think I can unmute him, or I can ask him to unmute. Ask to unmute. Carrol, you'll have to find your unmute button. There you go. Good.
Okay.
You are,
Carrol, can you talk?
you're unmuted, Carrol. You should be able to talk now. You should be. Let's bring on his video. There he is. Oh, you're talking, Carol, but we can't hear you. So
Carol, there would be a little red microphone button down on one of your panels. It might have
he's
like
unmuted.
okay.
And your microphone on your keyboard's unmuted, right? Sometimes it's F4 or Control 4 or Windows 4.
I think maybe his microphone's actually malfunctioning. That's what I'm worried about.
Yeah, it was working earlier though.
Right. Well, while we're waiting for that, why don't I just kind of go through some of these with Carol, until he can get on her. So, lead poisoning isn't just affecting swans, it also affects diving ducks and other waterfowl and loons. And loons, dive into the water, and obviously that's where they, pick up the fishing tackle. And so Minnesota did have a Get the Lead Out program, which actually used loons as their mascot. Is he on yet?
No.
Okay.
Is it worth addressing a couple of the questions while we're waiting for Carol to get sorted out there? Or?
That's not a bad idea, Margaret. What do you think about that? Answering some of
Sure,
maybe
that's fine.
questions?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's.
Sure, why don't we go ahead?
Hello.
Oh, you there, Carol?
Got him. Okay.
Can you got me now?
Yeah, we do. Okay.
Oh, great.
You want me-
Okay, it took a while.
Do you
Okay,
want me- do you want me to move
Okay.
back a slide, or do you want to start it from here?
let's just start from here. We need to make up some time.
Sure.
One of the unique things about the issue with lead in Minnesota is that we need to deal with a couple of very important species for Minnesotans, both loons and trumpeter swans. And loons dive to lake bottoms to pick up pebbles they used in their gizzards to grind up the small fishes they eat, and incidentally swallow lead jigs and sinkers at the same time because they're intermingled with those pellets. The swans tip down, not as deeply as the loons might go, to feed on submerged vegetation down to 3 or 4 feet, but they may also swallow jigs and sinkers by mistaking them for the grit that they need for their food, okay? And it only takes one lead sinker or jig to kill a loon or a swan. This is the content removed from a loon that died from that one lead sinker. Okay. Now we have a wonderful program here in Minnesota, and our project leaders are Kelly Amith and Stephen Yang, who are in charge of Get the Lead Out. And their program was funded, first of all, by $1.2 million from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife VP settlement for an aggressive Get the Lead Out program over the last several years. And that funding ended on July 1st this year. But the new Minnesota legislature then appropriated $1 million to continue their Get the Lead Out effort into the future. And the previous money was primarily focused just on helping loons. But now this new funding allows for a broader program that will address the Get the Lead Out needs for both loons and for trumpeter swans. So kudos to the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And they've been doing Get the Lead Out efforts in Minnesota ever since the year 2000. So they have wonderful experience and support. They have Get the Lead Out efforts with the National Loon Center and other conservation groups to address this problem. Okay. So that $1.2 million was a wonderful head start. We had a lot of loon or tackle exchanges where people could bring in their old lead tackle and get them exchanged for packets of new varieties of non-toxic fishing tackle. Okay. And one of the most intriguing aspects of this is that when tackle manufacturers started switching to non-toxic tackle, they discovered that tungsten, which has a greater density than lead, actually behaves differently in jigs, and they're actually preferred by bass anglers. So they thought this was a great opportunity to improve their tackle and their fishing success with using tungsten jigs. Okay. And we also have to give credit to the National Loon Center in Cross Lake, Minnesota for their aggressive program for promoting non-toxic fishing tackle to protect loons, much of it in collaboration with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. Okay. Now we have the National Loon Center, which is going to be doing the groundbreaking this coming year for promotion of loon conservation in the state, and also very aggressively promoting non-toxic loon-safe jigs. And they have a wonderful partner now, Lindy Legendary Fishing Tackle of Brainerd. They first signed on this summer to a Loons and Lakes Legacy Pledge, in which Lindy is now producing a new whole line of lead-free tackle this year, and they will be completely lead-free for all of their fishing tackle by 2027. We're hoping that additional tackle manufacturers will be jumping on board with the same program. Okay. And after that, $1.2 million from the Pollution Control Agency was expended by last July. Then the legislature in 1924 appropriated a new $1 million to the Pollution Control Agency to promote the use of non-toxic fishing tackle, that which I said can now benefit both loons and trumpeter swans. Okay. Now, we have a couple of case studies here that are unfortunate examples of what can happen. And a lot of people may not remember, in 2007, there were 26 trumpeter swans that died from lead poisoning at a historic duck hunting pass on Grass Lake in Stearns County, Minnesota. This place was heavily hunted for many, many years, and it had lots of lead shotgun pellets on the bottom, and it was a year that water levels were low. When the swans came in for wintering, the duck pass water was open, and the swans just really got poisoned. It killed 26 swans that year. As far as I know, none of them were saved. Many of them were on thin ice where people couldn't even go out and rescue the sick swans. And much of that lead is still on the lake bottom there, but we have not had any recent incidents reported of mortality from Grass Lake out in Stearns County. Okay. Our most recent incidents were trumpeter swans wintering at Sunker Lake in Lake Vadnais on the north edge of the Twin Cities. And this was a site that had open water during the winter. Okay. In 2019, 2020, lead jigs and sinkers lost by anglers at Sucker Lake at the outlet by these lakes poisoned 16 swans. And then an additional 10 additional swans have been found dead since then, and making a total of 26 swans, ironically, the same mortality that was found previously out in Stearns County. So this was another really unfortunate wake-up call that this concentration of anglers who were right at this site, heavily fished, was causing all of these swans to be poisoned. Go ahead. And this is a really popular fishing site, and because of the intensity, people simply lose a lot of fishing tackle. Go ahead. And the credit at the bottom of this slide, notice the name Dawn Tanner. She's one of our Minnesota conservation heroes. She took it on herself in the Vadnais Lake Water Management Organization District to reduce the toxicity of this area for the swans. She's had a very, very aggressive education program underway ever since that initial die-off. And so Dawn Tanner gets kudos for all of the effort that she's put in to make this a safer place for swans. Okay. And just as something brand new, I don't think anybody even knows about this yet. They had an awareness of how much lead there must be on this area. And so Justin Townsend of Ramsey County Soil and Water Conservation District is a scuba diver. And on October 24th, he went scuba diving to retrieve as much lead tackle as he could find on the bottom where these areas are heavily fished. Go ahead. So here's Justin in uniform. And he made 2 dives to scratch up whatever sinkers he could find. And he picked up 20 pounds of sinkers and jigs recovered in just 2 dives. Okay. And these are 2 containers containing that 20 pounds of lead fishing tackle recovered from the bottom of Sucker Lake, where all these swans were getting poisoned. So there, you could say there's probably tons more still out there that have not been retrieved. And this was probably the most toxic site we knew of in Minnesota where the swans were getting poisoned. So the efforts by Don in helping to reduce this problem is really appreciated. Go ahead. So these are the numbers that you need to see here about, first of all, the wonderful work that the Wildlife Rehab Center is doing in Roseville. So my compliments to Renee and her staff and volunteers for all the wonderful work that they do. In November 2020 to 21, they treated 32 swans for lead poisoning. Maybe they didn't all come from Sucker Lake, but probably most of them did. And next year, 20, 16, 6, and now this last year, I think we're down to about 3.
Carrol,
Yes.
Marianne, just breaking in, just to let you know, we have about 9 minutes left in our.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Okay.
I'm wrapping up right now. So anyway, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. We have to, I think there's a number of states where we have both populations of loons and trumpeter swans. And I just wanted to suggest that collaboration on behalf of both the loons and the swans is an important opportunity for us to help create awareness by anglers, for example, on how they are contributing to conservation by switching over to non-toxic tackle. So thank you for all your support, for all the support that's come to the donations to the Nongame Wildlife Program and the DNR, and also for all of the support we've had for Minnesota's trumpeter swan population, which we've kind of lost track. We are grossly estimating now that our population in the state may be as much as 50,000 trumpeter swans. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Laurie and Renee and Carrol. I really appreciate this. I think this is probably pretty eye-opening for a lot of people. I just want to say before we take questions, this is the holiday season, and if you know of anglers or hunters, I would highly recommend that you either get them non-lead tackle and non-lead ammunition or encourage them to do that. I think that's probably one of the best Christmas gifts you can give to wildlife. So, Marianne, do we have any questions that have come in? And if you have any questions, you guys just put them in the Q&A box.
Yes, we do have several questions. The first from Genevieve. Do we see the same symptoms in other waterfowl? Do ingested fish with lead in them cause issues for the birds?
Yes. So the same symptoms can be seen in other waterfowl, other piscivores, other mammals even, but it does vary by species. And we're not sure if that's just due to the dose, due to chronicity, due to specific species physiology. In waterfowl in general, we tend to see the same lethargy, GI issues, muscle weakness, respiratory issues. Occasionally, we will see different trends. Mallards do better than swans, and swans do better than geese with chelation therapy, but that is a little bit anecdotal because our numbers are still relatively low.
Thank you. And Martha has a question. If a swan can recover after chelation treatment, how is this fertility affected? And are they still able to mate? Can they have viable eggs? How does this affect the cygnets? Would there be birth defects, chromosomal damage? Would the cygnets be able to reproduce? So a lot of questions all around the.
Laurie, do you want to
long-term
answer that one
impact.
because of the study you did at the Raptor Center? And if not, I can.
Is she muted?
She's, oh yeah, muted. Let's see if we can ask her to unmute. Hopefully she's there. Otherwise, there we go.
Why don't you're a little bit more recent on the data than I am at this point. Thanks.
Yeah, I can definitely. So there was a lot of good post-release monitoring back when Laurie was at the Raptor Center, and they did an immense amount of swans in a short period of time. And I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Laurie, but I believe that the adults that came with lead poisoning did great and reproduced the next year in general, but the cygnets had a little bit less reproduction proportions. Is that what you remember?
Yes, that's correct. And, of course, there's a lot of reasons for the cygnets probably having lower chances for reproduction, just unrelated to lead. But, the adults that we successfully treated and released, the ones that we were able to track, were reproductively successful. But we're talking fairly small numbers, overall. So it wasn't a big population study by any means.
Exactly. And there's so many variables with lead toxicity, with the lead that gets ingested, and as well as the number of systems that get affected, that in order to tease out all those variables, we need hundreds and hundreds of swans to be able to have a firm grasp on this. I think the takeaway is that we should treat lead toxicity swans because they do have a chance to reproduce.
Thank you. Another question from Ryan is there any way to remove or lower the levels of lead that are already in the environment?
This is Margaret. I'm just going to say that, the issue with lead is, as Laurie had said, it doesn't dissolve, it stays in there. And so as it goes into the sediment or whatever, you're really looking at dredging. And so that's an expensive proposition. And I know where there's some areas, it's just not really doable. There's a whole lot of permitting and there's just a whole lot that's involved with that. So essentially, if I were to make a recommendation, I would say it's really up to us now to stop depositing lead into the environment. If we just reduce the amount of lead that's going in, then at least we're not adding to what danger is already out there.
I would add that
Yeah.
I was just going to mention that I think we need to be looking at lead as a forever toxic poison in the environment, where each year that we allow its use in both ammunition and fishing tackle, it just keeps putting more poison in the environment. And that the only way that we've been able to approach this in the past has been by education of anglers and hunters. And we've seen some pretty good response by some anglers and hunters realizing that, they shouldn't be putting this in the environment. And in the case of hunters, they shouldn't be bringing home lead-tainted venison and feeding it to their families, which is really stupid. But I think that legislative approaches are looked at as the ideal, but I don't know how much success those might have in the current political realm. So I think we need to be as aggressive as we can in educating hunters and anglers that we all, as conservationists, should be not putting permanent toxic poisons into the environment. That's not being a good conservationist.
And to clarify, lead was outlawed for waterfowl hunting only on federal lands. You can deposit lead wherever else you want in ammunition and in sinkers. So yeah, that great federal lands waterfowl hunting, but upland game, it's still legal. Some states, it's still legal to hunt with lead for waterfowl on state lands, and in private land, it's definitely legal. And then not to mention, like Carrol mentioned, the deer carcasses and whatnot. And it is a One Health concern. It's not just poisoning our animals. People get poisoned every year by eating those deer carcasses that have lead in them, and lots of other sources of lead.
Thank you. Another question. Do we see a difference in freshwater versus saltwater sites?
I don't know. Do you guys?
Well, trumpeter swans don't really use saltwater sites, so they only use freshwater. So you wouldn't see lead poisoned swans from saltwater. So I don't know if other birds, that are saltwater, that use the saltwater like oceans or whatever, what they pick up. Generally for the swans, they'll pick it up in the shallow areas where they feed. So it isn't like they go out deep, it's where they can reach. So it's usually within about 4 to 5 feet of water. It's the diving ducks and the loons that can go down into the sediment, but I think those are freshwater birds. I don't really know about saltwater lead poisoning.
And is it possible to distinguish between H1N1 and lead symptoms in the birds?
The symptoms for lead and avian influenza and a lot of other diseases are very generalized, and you will see those clinical signs on both lists. So it requires testing. You can use clues from the history, clues from the environment, clues from the prevalence in the area. But yeah, you have to test.
And then for the final question, what do you do to get lost minerals from chelation back into the swan?
So we give them those minerals back. So like the zinc and the iron that we provide during our chelation protocol is because the chelation is wiping out those minerals. There could be other ones that we aren't quite noticing or aren't seen as of value yet. But generally our patients tend to do well on long-term chelation with that protocol.
I'm sorry. Great. Well, thanks so much, everybody. I really appreciate you coming. And as your browser closes, do fill out the survey. We're very interested in your thoughts. So thank you.